Chapter 5: The Cost of Rescue. Cassius adjusted the straps on his saddle, his fingers lingering nervously on the leather. The cold morning mist hung thick, twisting through the air like a restless spirit, obscuring the world around them and muffling sound. It seemed to reflect Cassius's own uncertainty, wrapping around him as if to echo his doubts. He stole a glance towards Reid, standing calmly beside his horse, eyes fixed on the distant ridgeline. The soldier's expression was unreadable, the hard lines of his face set in quiet determination. Reid had a way of making every decision seem inevitable, as though there were no other choices left. Yet beneath his stoic demeanor, Cassius knew the cost of what they were doing weighed heavily upon him as well. Cassius felt the heaviness too, felt it in the slight tremor of his hands, the dryness in his throat. He wasn't a warrior, not like Reid or Sir Aldrich. He was a scholar, a machinator, a keeper of arcane secrets and ancient machines. Leaving Reid and the others behind now, when danger was closing in from every side, felt like a betrayal. He had voiced his fears once more, just moments ago, but Reid had only shaken his head gently and looked him straight in the eye. "If we don't make it back," Reid had said quietly, placing a steady hand on Cassius's shoulder, "that research has to be enough." It had to be enough. Cassius swallowed hard, the weight of those words sitting like lead in his gut. The scrolls they had salvaged from Valen's ruined sanctum, the final breakthroughs of the tether principle, were bundled securely in the saddlebag beside him. They were their best hope, perhaps their only hope, if the mission to rescue Velen ended in disaster. The soft crunch of boots against gravel pulled Cassius's attention back to the moment. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Soren approaching slowly, his thin frame swallowed by a travel cloak that seemed much too large for him. The boy's face was pale, dark eyes wide with anxiety, yet he kept his back straight and his chin lifted slightly, determined to appear brave. "Ready?" Cassius asked softly, offering a gentle smile to ease Soren's visible nerves. Soren nodded hesitantly, though his eyes flickered with a doubt that he couldn't fully hide. "I'm ready," he said, his voice a quiet tremor. Cassius noticed how tightly the boy's hands gripped the reins of his horse, knuckles white and muscles visibly straining beneath the skin. Cassius stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm scared too, you know. But fear just means we understand what's at stake. It's courage that keeps us moving despite it." Soren glanced up sharply, surprise flickering across his eyes before giving way to quiet gratitude. Velen always said courage wasn't being fearless. It was choosing to act even when fear held your heart. Cassius smiled softly, recognizing Valen's wisdom immediately. "Sounds like something he would say." Sir Aldrich approached then, his heavy steps firm and decisive. Two knights trailed closely behind him, Sir Halvrin and Sir Odrin. Cassius recognized them as some of Aldrich's finest, their faces etched with the scars of countless battles, their eyes hard and focused. Aldrich stopped in front of Cassius, his eyes steady, filled with solemn weight. "These two will escort you," Aldrich announced, his voice deep and grave. "They know the roads better than any man alive, and they know how to fight. They will get you safely back to Veletria, at any cost." Cassius nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He could see in the knights' eyes that they understood exactly what Aldrich meant by any cost. The gravity of their mission wasn't lost on anyone. Sir Halvrin and Sir Odrin both met Cassius's gaze, their expressions resolute and unwavering. "We'll see you safely home, machinator," Halvrin said quietly, his voice calm yet resolute. Sir Odrin gave a small nod, adding quietly, "No harm shall come to either of you while we draw breath." Cassius felt a wave of gratitude, mingled with sorrow. He had never been comfortable with the price of war, the sacrifices demanded so casually, but now there was no escaping it. These men had willingly pledged their lives to protect what he carried, the knowledge that could tip the balance of the conflict. Aldrich clasped each knight firmly on the shoulder before stepping back. "Ride fast and trust no one. The Empire will be looking for you, and they won't hesitate." Halvrin and Odrin nodded solemnly, mounting their horses in practiced, fluid motions. The tension in their shoulders was evident, but they showed no hesitation. This was their duty, and they would see it done. Cassius climbed into the saddle, glancing once more at Reid. The captain stood silently, watching, his expression unreadable. Yet Cassius knew what was behind that mask, the burden of command, the weight of sending others into danger. Reid gave a single, slow nod, unspoken assurance passing between them. The group moved out in silence, the horses' hooves muted against the thick forest floor. Cassius rode next to Soren, offering a brief but reassuring glance. The boy returned it, nodding silently, the quiet courage in his eyes finally overcoming the fear. They rode away, each hoofbeat pulling them further from the ruins, from Reid, from the desperate gamble unfolding behind them. And as the mist closed around them, Cassius vowed silently that this gamble would pay off, that he would not fail the men whose lives had now become bound to his own. The weight of their sacrifice settled upon him, heavy but resolute, driving him forward through the mist toward whatever fate awaited in Veletria. Cassius vanished into the mist, and as the echo of hoofbeats faded, Reid felt a cold weight settle firmly into his chest. He forced himself to turn away, knowing he couldn't afford to linger on the thought of failure. Not now, not when every second was precious. Aldrich stood silently beside him, watching the shifting fog with an expression carved from stone, his eyes hard and unflinching. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. They both knew the price of their decisions. The lives now held delicately in balance. Reid swung up onto his horse, ignoring the dull ache of exhaustion settling deep in his muscles. Around him, the 8 remaining knights were already mounted, their faces drawn but determined. Aldrich pulled his own steed closer, his posture straight and unwavering despite the fatigue shadowing his eyes. They set off without another word, urgency thickening the silence between them. The rising sun gradually dispersed the lingering mist, unveiling a harsh, unforgiving landscape of jagged foothills and dense woodland, twisted and scarred by the unmistakable passage of the Imperial forces. Reid narrowed his eyes, scanning ahead as the signs of the enemy's passage became clearer. Broken branches, deep ruts carved by heavy wagon wheels, and churned earth from armored warhorses painted a vivid trail that stretched into the distant hills. The Imperial army had moved without subtlety, confident in their numbers and the absence of pursuit. Reid felt a bitter satisfaction knowing their arrogance would be their downfall, yet the harsh truth gnawed at him. The enemy had every reason for their arrogance. Veletria's resources were stretched thin, their knights tired, and the coming fight promised more casualties than they could afford. "They aren't bothering to hide their movements," Aldrich muttered darkly, eyes tracking the furrows left by heavy carts. "They must think no one's coming after them. Or they're daring us to follow," Reid replied grimly, hoping we'll charge straight into their blades. Aldrich grunted softly. "Then they don't know us very well." Reid glanced briefly at Aldrich, noting the knight's quiet confidence, solid and dependable even under pressure. He didn't know Aldrich fully, not yet, but from what he'd seen so far, he felt the man could handle whatever lay ahead. It was enough for now to believe Aldrich wouldn't falter easily. They rode in silence for several more leagues, pressing hard against the fatigue that threatened to seep into their bones. The relentless pace took its toll, each mile sapping strength and sharpening nerves. As the sun climbed higher, the trail grew more rugged, winding between steep hillsides and plunging through narrow ravines. The knights moved carefully, their horses sure-footed but weary. Reid could see it in their posture, in the way they adjusted their armor more frequently, the quiet strain etched into each lined face. Yet no one spoke a word of complaint or asked for respite. These men knew what was at stake and refused to falter. Reid raised a clenched fist, signaling a halt as they crested a rocky ridge. Aldrich quickly drew alongside him, squinting toward the distant slopes below. A wide swath of flattened grass and churned earth showed where the Imperial forces had split their caravan. Heavy wagon tracks looped around easier slopes to the east, while lighter hoofprints and sharper tracks veered straight upwards along a narrower, steeper trail. "They divided here," Reid said quietly, pointing down toward the split. Heavy wagons to the easier terrain, cavalry straight through the high path. Aldrich nodded, understanding instantly. "Valen will be with the cavalry. They'll keep him close to their fastest units to ensure no rescue catches them." "Agreed," Reid said, his voice tight. "We follow them directly. We can't afford to lose ground." Aldrich turned slightly, calling back softly to the knights behind them. "Check your weapons and mounts, we'll push harder now. No rests until we close the gap." There was no dissent, no complaints. The knights quickly tightened straps, checked weapons, and drank sparingly from water skins, before readying themselves once again. Reid felt pride stir within him, tempered by the gnawing awareness of what they faced. Every knight here was willing to ride straight into death itself if it meant completing the mission. The terrain grew steadily harsher, their horses struggling to maintain the relentless pace. Loose stones shifted beneath hooves, and narrow pathways skirted cliffs that dropped steeply to jagged rocks below. The Empire had driven their mounts hard as well, leaving signs of exhaustion in occasional discarded gear and abandoned supplies along their path. Despite the danger and the strain of pursuit, Reid kept his focus unwavering. He allowed himself no thoughts of doubt, no room for second-guessing. Each moment was a calculation, a constant assessment of risk against the slim chance of reward. Beside him, Aldrich rode with quiet intensity, always alert, always prepared. Reid drew strength from the knight's presence, finding reassurance in the calm determination that Aldrich exuded effortlessly. Midday found them deep within the hills, their progress slowed by the rugged, twisting paths that forced them to dismount occasionally to lead the horses safely across dangerous stretches. At one such point, Reid paused briefly to inspect a series of tracks. They were clear, defined, Imperial warhorses carrying heavily armored riders, their shoes distinctively heavier, leaving unmistakable marks. "They're not far," Reid said quietly, brushing his fingertips across the hoofprints. "A few hours ahead at most." Aldrich shifted restlessly in his saddle, glancing around the narrow defile. "If they have scouts posted, we could walk right into a trap." Reid straightened, adjusting his armor. "Then we'll have to spring it first," he said, determination hardening his voice. "We've come this far. Turning back now isn't an option." "No," Aldrich agreed solemnly, gripping his sword hilt tightly. "It never was." Reid turned and regarded the knights arrayed silently behind them. Faces lined with weariness stared back at him, yet each one held a fierce resolve. They knew the odds, understood the cost, and still stood ready to follow him into whatever lay ahead. In their expressions he saw not just obedience but faith. Faith in him, in Aldrich, in the rightness of their mission. "Stay alert," Reid told them, his voice firm and clear. "Eyes open, weapons ready. When we catch them, it'll happen fast. Be prepared for anything." A low chorus of affirmations rose from the knights, muted but resolute. They straightened in their saddles, fatigue momentarily forgotten, steeling themselves for what would surely come. Reid felt a deep sense of pride and sorrow intertwine within him, a fierce determination welling up from his core. Without another word, he nudged his mount forward, leading them deeper into the hills, closer to the enemy, closer to the point of no return. They moved swiftly, silently, determined to catch their quarry before darkness fell. The tension in the air thickened with every passing mile, each step drawing them closer to an uncertain fate. As the sun passed its zenith, casting stark shadows against the rocky terrain, Reid raised a clenched fist, signaling the knights to halt. Aldrich silently reined in beside him, eyes sharp, senses attuned to the slightest disturbance in their surroundings. Below, nestled within a small hollow shielded by jagged, moss-covered stones, lay a small Imperial patrol. 5 soldiers, clad in polished armor dulled now by dust and grime from the trail, milled about a temporary encampment. One officer, distinguished by his elaborate helm and a cloak bearing the unmistakable golden insignia of the Holy Empire, paced restlessly between his men, barking curt orders in a voice heavy with impatience and irritation. Reid studied them carefully, his breath slowed, each heartbeat measured as he quickly analyzed the enemy's disposition. 4 soldiers and an officer, enough for information, small enough to be dealt with swiftly. Reid turned toward Aldrich, who nodded without the need for a single spoken word. He signaled 2 knights forward, gesturing toward their crossbows. Quietly, they dismounted and disappeared into the brush, blending seamlessly into the rocky outcroppings above the Imperial patrol. Reid waited, his gaze never wavering from the officer who was now arguing animatedly with one of his men. His posture conveyed arrogance, confidence, the look of a man who had grown accustomed to power. Reid would use that against him. He raised a finger, holding it steady in the air for a long second. The knights held their breath. Aldrich tensed silently beside him, sword at the ready. Then, Reid dropped his finger sharply, signaling the attack. The silence shattered in an instant. Crossbow bolts sliced through the air, finding their marks with merciless precision. 2 soldiers collapsed immediately, struck down before they could draw their blades. The remaining 2 Imperial soldiers scrambled for their weapons, eyes wide with panic. But Aldrich and his knights surged from their concealment, blades flashing in the sunlight as they closed the distance with terrifying speed. Reid moved swiftly, his pistol drawn but held ready rather than firing. He needed the officer alive, for now. The Imperial spun around at the sudden commotion, shouting orders desperately as his men fell around him. His face paled visibly, confusion overtaking arrogance as his carefully ordered patrol crumbled within moments. "Protect the commander!" one soldier shouted desperately, charging forward to shield his superior. Aldrich intercepted the soldier, sword cleaving downward in a brutal arc, silencing him instantly. The last soldier, driven by pure desperation, tried to flee, only to meet his end beneath another knight's blade. The officer stood alone, sword drawn, eyes darting rapidly from knight to knight as he searched for an escape. Aldrich stepped forward calmly, his armored frame looming, his face hardened with grim resolve. "Yield!" he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Make this easy on yourself." The officer spat defiantly, lunging recklessly forward. Aldrich parried the blow effortlessly, twisting the man's blade aside and driving his armored fist into the officer's gut. The officer doubled over, gasping, sword clattering to the rocky ground. Aldrich dragged him upright by the collar, holding him firmly in place as Reid approached, holstering his pistol calmly. Reid looked into the officer's face, young, defiant, still trying to hide his fear behind a mask of bravado. Reid felt no pleasure in this, only grim necessity. "Carduran," Reid said simply. "You're taking Valen there?" The officer sneered, his expression one of contempt despite his pain. "You'll learn nothing from me." Reid regarded him coolly for a moment, before calmly reaching out and gripping the officer's hand, isolating one finger. Without hesitation, he applied steady pressure, bending the digit until a sharp crack pierced the air. The officer screamed, eyes watering in agony. "You're wasting my time," Reid said quietly, his voice steady, unyielding. "Start talking, or I'll start breaking things you actually need." The officer's breathing was ragged, his defiance fractured but still lingering. Reid calmly reached for a second finger. The officer trembled, clearly desperate, finally breaking beneath the unyielding certainty in Reid's eyes. "Stop! Please, I'll speak," the officer gasped, voice thick with pain and fear. "What do you want to know?" "Valen," Reid said, applying just enough pressure to emphasize the threat. "Where is he?" The officer swallowed, eyes wide. "Nearby, a fortified outpost heavily guarded. They'll move him by morning to Carduran. Once he's there, he's beyond your reach." Reid pressed slightly harder, another finger straining. "Why keep him alive?" The officer hissed in pain, shaking his head desperately. "They need him. Alive! He's valuable. They won't kill him until they've extracted every secret he has." Reid leaned in, voice dangerously low. "And how long until they move him to Carduran?" The officer's breath hitched, voice cracking. "Tonight. By dawn, he'll be inside the gates, untouchable. Carduran, you're already too late." Reid held his gaze a moment longer before releasing his grip. He stepped back, allowing Aldrich to steady the officer again. Aldrich met Reid's gaze with a dark, meaningful look. Reid nodded slowly. The knight understood immediately. With swift efficiency, Aldrich drew his dagger and drove it cleanly into the officer's chest. The officer's eyes widened briefly in shock before his body went limp, falling lifelessly to the ground. Reid exhaled slowly, turning his attention toward the horizon where the sun was beginning its slow descent. They now had a target and an unforgiving timeline. The outpost awaited. As the evening shadows began stretching long fingers across the rugged terrain, Reid and his small band moved swiftly, urgency pressing them onward. The fortified outpost sat nestled in a narrow valley, its stone walls rough but solid, clearly designed to withstand assaults and hold prisoners securely. From their concealed vantage point amid rocky outcroppings above the valley, Reid silently studied the layout. 25 Imperial soldiers at least, armored and vigilant, patrolled methodically around the perimeter. At the heart of the outpost stood 4 imposing knights in heavy, ornate plate armor, their presence alone marking them as formidable foes. From this vantage, Reid silently assessed the layout. The outpost was compact, guarded by a heavy iron gate at the front and watchtowers at each corner, each manned by attentive sentries. He glanced at Aldrich, noting the tense set of the knight's shoulders. Aldrich's gaze remained fixed upon the enemy, his voice barely audible as he murmured, "Those knights could tear through our men without hesitation. We need a clear plan." Reid nodded slowly, thoughts racing. The outpost had only 2 real entry points. The main gates, heavily fortified and guarded tightly, and a smaller, narrower side entrance, likely less defended but equally risky if discovered prematurely. They needed stealth, speed, and above all, a distraction effective enough to pull attention away from their infiltration. "We create chaos outside their gates," Reid whispered, his voice firm but low. "2 knights with smoke bombs and arrows. Draw out as many soldiers as possible. Then we slip in and grab Valen." Aldrich nodded slowly, eyes narrowing in calculation. "A feint," he agreed. "Enough noise and smoke to make them think a larger force is upon them." Reid turned toward the waiting knights behind them, their faces pale yet resolute in the fading light. "2 of you will set the diversion. Smoke bombs, arrows, shouts. Make it convincing, then withdraw quickly. Don't stay and fight. The rest of us slip inside in the confusion." The knights understood immediately, nodding solemnly, accepting the risks without hesitation. Reid felt a pang deep in his chest at their willingness, their readiness to sacrifice themselves without question. As darkness fully claimed the valley, the chosen knights silently moved into position, preparing their distraction. Reid led Aldrich and the remaining knights quietly down the slope, positioning themselves near the rear wall of the outpost. His hand instinctively rested on the sidearm at his belt. Only 6 rounds remained. Every shot had to count. The sword at his hip was little reassurance. He was no master swordsman, far from it. He'd rely on it only if forced. Suddenly, shouts erupted near the front gate, quickly followed by thick plumes of dark smoke billowing skyward. Soldiers rushed toward the commotion, leaving the courtyard momentarily vulnerable. Taking advantage, Reid and Aldrich swiftly scaled the rear wall, slipping quietly into the compound, hearts pounding, senses alert to the slightest sound. For a fleeting moment, their plan seemed perfect. They advanced silently, edging past barracks and stables, until suddenly a knight had struck too soon, panicking at the sight of an Imperial guard emerging unexpectedly from a barracks door. The Imperial collapsed lifelessly to the ground, but the damage was done. His body was spotted almost instantly. Alarm bells clanged instantly, their harsh echoes tearing through the night. Soldiers surged forth from doorways, confusion rapidly giving way to fury. The narrow corridors and tight corners erupted in chaos. Crossbow bolts hissed dangerously close, and soldiers shouted frantic orders. Reid drew his sidearm swiftly, leveling it at an Imperial charging toward him, blade drawn. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the compound, and the soldier collapsed instantly, eyes wide with shock. Another soldier rushed Reid, and without hesitation he fired again, dropping the man where he stood. 4 shots left. He needed to conserve them carefully. The knights fought desperately, swords clashing in desperate, fierce melee. Aldrich fought at the head of their formation, his movements precise and deadly, every swing efficient and calculated. Reid, lacking Aldrich's skill, fired again as an Imperial knight clad in ornate armor lunged forward, blade raised high. The heavy armor was no match for Reid's bullet. It punched clean through the breastplate, sending the knight crumpling to the ground in stunned disbelief. Reid mentally noted. 3 shots left. They surged forward into the courtyard. At its center stood Valen's prisoner carriage, heavily reinforced with iron. Reid sprinted toward it, urgency burning through every nerve. Inside, slumped against the bars, was Valen, battered, bloodied, but alive. The old artificer looked up, managing a defiant smirk despite his obvious injuries. "Took your damn sweet time," Valen rasped hoarsely. Reid quickly smashed open the carriage lock with the butt of his sidearm. "Can you move?" Valen struggled upright. Pain etched deep into his features, but determination burned fiercely in his eyes. "If it means getting out of here, I'll crawl." Aldrich appeared at Reid's side, his blade slick with blood. "We need to move, now." Imperial reinforcements began pouring into the courtyard, shouts growing louder as they rallied. Reid supported Valen, retreating urgently toward the breach. Behind them, knights fought desperately, sacrificing their lives to buy crucial seconds. 2 knights fell swiftly, their lifeless bodies staining the dirt. A third, bloodied yet defiant, stood alone in the gateway, sword swinging tirelessly even as Imperials closed around him. Reid glanced back, anguish tightening his chest at the loss unfolding behind them. But they couldn't stop. With Valen stumbling weakly beside him, supported by Aldrich, they fled into the gathering darkness. The shouts of Imperials faded slowly behind them, but Reid knew this was only the beginning. The Empire would pursue them relentlessly. As the harsh cries and ringing steel faded into distant echoes, Reid touched his sidearm again, counting silently to himself. 3 shots left. He would have to make each one count, for the next battle would surely demand all that remained. and more. Reid moved swiftly through the darkness, supporting Valen's weakened frame as the battered group emerged from the shadow of the outpost into the chill evening air. Behind them, the chaos of their attack gradually faded into distant shouts and the muted clang of alarm bells. The echoes of combat grew faint, replaced by the quiet, ragged breaths of men burdened by exhaustion and loss. Their horses stood restless, yet waiting where they'd been tethered, stamping uneasily at the scent of blood and smoke still heavy on their riders. Aldrich wasted no time, quickly stepping forward and helping Reid lift Valen gently onto a horse. The old artificer clenched his jaw tightly, sweat and dried blood tracing grim patterns down his pale, bruised face, yet his hands gripped the saddle horn firmly. Reid silently admired the stubborn grit in the man. Despite his injuries, Valen gave no complaint, no whisper of weakness. In silence, Reid mounted his own steed, muscles protesting as fatigue gnawed at the edges of his endurance. Around him, the surviving knights did the same, their movements stiff with exhaustion, their expressions haunted by the empty saddles of fallen comrades. Aldrich hesitated just a fraction of a moment, eyes lingering on those vacant spaces, each one a stark reminder of the price they'd already paid. But the knight swiftly turned forward again, burying his grief beneath cold resolve. Without another word, Aldrich led their small band away from the bloody ruin behind them, urging their mounts onward into the increasingly harsh wilderness. The terrain quickly became treacherous, forcing their pace to slow despite their urgency. Jagged stone pathways twisted and narrowed, winding ever upward through dark ravines and precarious ledges. Rocks loosened beneath their horses' hooves, clattering ominously into unseen depths below, reminding them of the precariousness of their route. Behind them, the distant flicker of imperial torches was already visible, threading through the valley like malevolent fireflies. Reid glanced back once, a tightening sensation gripping his chest. They were being pursued, relentlessly hunted, chased by an enemy who wouldn't rest until their quarry was recaptured or dead. The chill intensified as they ascended higher into the rugged mountains. Reid pulled his cloak tighter against the biting wind, silently assessing their progress. His muscles ached, and fatigue settled like a leaden weight upon his shoulders, but he dared not falter. Beside him, Valen swayed dangerously in the saddle, clearly weakened by captivity and harsh treatment, yet the old man's stubbornness kept him upright. As the night wore on and the temperature plummeted further, Aldrich eventually signaled for a brief halt. The knights dismounted carefully in the rocky alcove, quickly securing their weary mounts and checking wounds in hurried silence. Reid helped Valen down, guiding him gently toward a flat stone where he could rest briefly. Valen steadied himself against the rough rock, breathing shallowly. Reid moved quietly beside him, offering silent support. Valen's gaze drifted upward slowly, his dark eyes finding Reid's with startling clarity despite the pain etched deeply into his expression. "You're not from here," Valen murmured quietly, voice barely audible above the wind. Reid hesitated, considering carefully before responding. "No, I'm not." Valen studied him intently, as though peering through layers of uncertainty. Finally he nodded faintly, a fleeting smile tugging at his cracked lips. "Then perhaps you've arrived precisely when you were most needed." Reid didn't answer, unsure what to make of the cryptic remark. He turned away briefly, distracted by the cold bite of wind and the distant sound of imperial horns drifting ominously toward them. Aldrich, standing close by, shifted uneasily at the noise, his expression darkening further. "How long do you think they'll pursue?" Aldrich asked, voice low, burdened with weariness and sorrow. Reid exhaled sharply, eyes locked on the distant lights. "They'll chase until we're dead or they are," he answered flatly, his voice steady and unyielding. "The Empire won't let Valen slip from their grasp, not after all they've risked to capture him." Valen straightened slightly, gripping a nearby stone for balance as he struggled to steady his breathing. His voice, though thin and strained, was clear enough. "He's right. I hold knowledge they won't let escape easily." Aldrich nodded gravely, absorbing the stark reality of their situation. His fingers tightened reflexively around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles whitening briefly before he relaxed. "Then we make each step costly," he muttered fiercely, eyes hardening with resolve. "Every Imperial who comes for us will pay dearly." Reid turned back toward Valen, silently assessing the old artificer's condition. They couldn't rest much longer. Every minute brought the Empire closer, but pushing Valen beyond his limits would doom them all. Aldrich seemed to sense Reid's dilemma, turning swiftly to the other knights to rally them once more. Valen drew a shaky breath, eyes fixed on Reid with sudden intensity. "I know paths through these mountains," he whispered urgently. "Old routes forgotten by the Empire. We can evade them if we're quick enough." Reid met Valen's steady gaze, finding quiet confidence beneath the pain and exhaustion. "Then we'll follow your lead," Reid said firmly. Valen managed a faint nod of gratitude and reassurance, even as the tremor in his limbs betrayed his weakness. Aldrich returned swiftly, signaling the knights to mount again. The men moved stiffly, exhaustion clear in their every movement, yet they made no complaints, voicing no hesitation. They'd come this far and sacrificed too much already to turn back now. Valen was helped carefully back onto his mount, his grim determination evident in the way he stubbornly ignored the obvious pain. Reid gave him one final nod before swinging into the saddle himself, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle upon him once more. Behind them, the horns grew louder, clearer, echoing with frightening clarity through the mountain passes. With Valen's whispered guidance, Aldrich led them onward swiftly, descending into winding mountain trails that twisted deeper into shadow. Reid rode close behind, mind racing with silent calculations and grim assessments of their dwindling options. Ahead, the path became ever more perilous, but there was no turning back now. They had committed themselves entirely to this dangerous gamble. As they pressed onward, the distant sound of the Empire's pursuit intensified, horns echoing ominously, torchlight staining the darkness behind them. Reid tightened his grip on the reins, readying himself for the grueling chase to come. He stole one more glance at Valen, reassured by the old man's stubborn resolve despite his battered body. They had wagered everything on this mission, on a desperate rescue, and now on a perilous flight through hostile mountains. Reid set his jaw firmly, pushing aside exhaustion and doubt, knowing there was no turning back. The Empire would hunt them relentlessly through these mountains, driving them until they were caught or found freedom. And Reid, despite everything stacked against them, felt himself prepared, ready to face whatever awaited them in the darkness ahead.